Hello and welcome back to Deck Doctor. This week we are going to cover a very spicy deck list. This is Modgnik's blue-yellow PewPew, and this is a blast from the past. This deck was very popular in early access, but as the game became more mobile, as with mobility creatures such as Sagami Grovecaller and stuff like that, the deck fell off. But it's made its return through Modgnik making a newer version. I've been playing this a lot, and it is a lot of fun, but it's very difficult. This deck has no archetype. It basically adapts to whatever your opponent's playing and adapts to specific situations where you feel you can win the game quickly or you need to control the board. It takes a very good game sense about understanding Faeria and what you're going to be playing against to be able to play this deck. It's top of the difficulty curve, but it's very rewarding and it's a lot of fun when it starts to snowball. So yeah, with this deck you can control the board, you can go really aggressive with Archers and Aurora's Disciple, and you really, like I said, have to adapt to what your opponent's doing because its matchups are very much based on what your opponent's playing and how you adapt to it. It's strange. It's a deck that if it's... it's so hard to describe this deck. I was having a conversation with Modgnik about it today in my stream, and it's a deck that does really good in very specific situations, and it is a deck that can completely flop if your opponent has the right answers to the right packages, because you can play this deck in so many different ways. For an example, the yellow package in this deck, the Archers, the Chargers, and Kaleem, these guys are very good at controlling the board, and the Archers can push damage, but very vulnerable to, say, red removal. Whereas the blue package of this deck, with the Aurora's Disciple and all the events, the Aurora's Disciple can actually get out of range of the red cards, but is very weak to yellow and blue because of the hard removal and the transform effect. So it's strange. It's a deck. It's a deck you kind of have to play and kind of grind it out a bit, and then figure it out and figure out how to play against all these different decks in Faeria. So I'll go into more detail as we go through this video. So let's move on to the cards and let's just get into it. Let's see what this deck can do. To start off, we have the yellow creatures, Windstorm Archer, very powerful card in this deck. He gains +1 power every time you use an event, so he can become very powerful very quickly. And you can also use mobility tricks in this deck to move him into positions where he can clear opposing threats. Without taking any damage himself. He is a ranged unit, so he has the advantage of picking off enemies at a distance. Windstorm Charger, again another card that gets powered up by the event package in this deck. He is very mobile as well, charge 2, and can usually trade up the curve. I've talked about this card a lot in my previous videos, but the one advantage you have with this deck is you have stuff like Kaleem's Training and Shifting Tide that gives you that extra bit of mobility. Kaleem, an amazing legendary card, one of the best cards in the game. It has a great place in this deck because of all the mobility tricks like Flash, Wind, and Shifting Tide, but also can apply board control and pressure, which is what this deck does, as I explained in the introduction. It switches from different archetypes based on different situations, and Kaleem is perfect for that. He fits in a lot of different decks. The blue creatures in this deck provide a lot of support, but also a very bulky creature in the Disciple. Lore Thief is a good collector, but he also provides you with card draw. There's a lot of 1-cost, 0-cost cards in this deck, which help power up the Archer, the Charger, and the Disciple. So it's great to get that card draw going, so you have more options and more ways to power up your creatures. Aurora's Disciple synergizes excellent with event decks, gets bigger and bigger, very hard to deal with when it comes to red players. If you focus on this card when you go up against red, it can be really hard to handle because you can snowball its stats out of the reach of their removal. Aurora is another great card in this deck as well. Again, you can push the power of your Aurora's Disciple in, say, the red matchup, or you can power up, say, the Archer, the Windstorm Archer, and push lots of damage. So yeah, it's one of the things with this deck, as I explained earlier, it's hard to really break down each card and what they do individually for the deck because it's very situational on how you use these cards, and I hoped Deck Pilot will fill those gaps that I might be missing in some of my card explanations. These are some of the mobility events. You have Flash Wind, which is a 0 cost if you move your own creature, and a free cost if you move your opponent's. This allows you to move around your chargers and your archers into more favorable positions to clear enemies, or to combine it with something like Kaleem's training to push lots of damage. So a cool combo, for example, is if you have a powered up Aurora's Disciple, in one turn you could chuck a training on it, flash wind it to your opponent, and push incredible amounts of damage. So a lot of utility with flash wind. You can even move your opponent's creatures out the way so your archers can get hits in. And Kaleem's training is also great on your archers as well, because you can fly them around the board, move them into more secure positions away from enemy threats. And yeah, use that flash wind to kind of zip around ocean tiles and get shots off with the archer. Shifting Tides has a dual ability of draw a card or move a land. Most of the time you're going to want to move a land with it. Maybe move your archer into a position where he can shoot something, move your charger into a position where he can clear an enemy. But drawing a card sometimes is fine. You know, this deck can kind of get clogged up with events, so drawing creatures is very important, and Shifting Tides helps with that. Time of Legend is a fantastic card in this deck because it searches for two of the most powerful legendary cards in the game, but also has that event synergy with your archers, chargers, and disciples. So it has that flexibility of powering up your creatures, but like I said, it also searches for those powerful legendary cards. Could be good opener for you as well if you haven't got Kaleem in your opening hand. You know, that's one of the best openers for any yellow deck. You can search for him, but a problem you could run into is you pick up Aurora instead. So having two very powerful legendaries in your deck makes this card a little less consistent, but for one Faeria you might as well see if you get that legendary need in the right situation and see if it has any impact on the game. Soul Drain is another fantastic event. It heals you, it deals 2 damage, but also again powers up those event cards. So a good combo is Soul Draining a target that your archer is targeting, and that deals 2 damage. Your archer gets a power up of +1, and that's 4 damage in total with the archer shot as well. So you can really work out how you squeeze that little bit of extra damage with events, and Soul Drain is usually quite helpful to finding those clears you need. Outland Ranger is amazing in this deck. Not only is it a creature that's going to collect Faeria for you and challenge other creatures on board, but it gives you a Campfire. Now, Campfire is an incredibly powerful card. A 1-cost event +1/+1 is amazing in this deck. It's going to power up your disciples. It's going to extend the reach of your charger, giving it 5 health, so it may survive a trade, but also going to give more damage to your archers. There's a lot of different uses for Campfire in this deck, and it'll really extend the reach of your creatures. The mulligan for this deck can be pretty complicated because most of the time the specific colours of your creatures are better in certain matchups, but it's very hard to determine what matchup you're going up against, especially if you've never played that opponent before and you have no idea if they've changed their deck or not if you have played them before. So I like to stick to yellow creatures simply because they provide a lot of mobility and they provide a lot of pressure in the early game. Windstorm Archer, you know, immediately starts shooting at your opponent's orb, and your opponent must respect that the archer can move around and maybe clear creatures from afar. Charger has charge 2, so you can collect Faeria and maybe challenge some of your opponent's harvesters as well. And Kaleem, you know, is just the big daddy when it comes to openers for yellow. You know, he's a fantastic creature that has great health, charge 2 and flying, so you can fly over ocean tiles and collect on whichever side you're not building the land towards. And yeah, he can provide a lot of pressure, be it just gathering Faeria, hitting your opponent's orb and gaining followers, or contesting your opponent's creatures. Other cards you want to consider in your mulligan is Time of Legend. It can find that Kaleem for you, so you have the Kaleem opener, but it could backfire and you could find Aurora. So it's kind of a gamble, but I think the gamble pays off because Aurora will definitely help you later, well, in the early game or in the late game, but Kaleem is obviously the perfect opener. If you do find a creature, especially something like an archer, Soul Drain can really help in clearing your opposing threats. So I like to keep some removal just to be able to challenge my opponent's harvesters in the early game. Lastly, Outland Ranger is a Pretty amazing keep. Not only is it an early harvester, but it gives you that campfire as well, so you can extend the reach of your creatures, but you can also power up the Outland Ranger straight away to allow it to dodge popular removal, challenge stuff with 4 health, and start harvesting Faeria for you. So Outland Ranger is generally the best keep, I think, but you know, the chargers, the archers, and Kaleem, of course, are fantastic. The one thing you want to consider with your mulligan is you want creatures, because there's so many events that are quite situational sometimes in this deck. Getting a creature down early is going to allow you not only to provide board pressure, but also harvest Faeria, and allow you to pull off these crazy combos this deck is capable of. This deck is a little pricey with all the legendaries, but if you take the legendaries away, it's actually really cheap. It has 15 commons and 12 rares, but it has 3 legendaries, which really beef up its cost. This deck can be played without them. It will suffer some power. You know, Aurora, for example, I would say is the staple out of all of them, because it extends the reach of your archers, your chargers, and your disciples. But Kaleem you can probably get away without running until you can craft him, and Time of Legend is to help having those 2 legendaries. So if you don't have any of the legendaries, you don't even need Time of Legend, which makes this deck super cheap. Some of the changes I would definitely consider, you could drop Kaleem and Aurora and add 2 Windstorm Colossus. There's a lot of events in this deck, and this can provide a finisher for you. We already know how popular Yellow Events is right now and how powerful this card is. The Dash 3 allows you to get into offensive or defensive positions, and it's a 7/7, so it's a very bulky, aggressive creature, which you can probably get to 5 very easily with this deck. The other change is Time of Legend, so if you're not running the 2 legendaries, you don't need this anyway. One thing I've really liked in this deck as a one-off is Last Nightmare. Now this deck doesn't pack any hard removal, even though it uses yellow, but that one Last Nightmare can set up some great stuff for you, especially against green. So green have a lot of bulky creatures. Being able to remove 1 bulky creature could open a doorway up to you finishing the game in a couple of turns. It's very hard to explain these choices sometimes, and you really need to play the deck and have a feel for it first, and then you'll understand, because like I said, it's quite a complicated deck, and I'm hoping Deck Pilot can answer some of your questions. What advantages do you have playing this deck? First things first, like I said previously, the deck is quite difficult, but it has a lot going for it. Tremendous amounts of mobility, so you're going to be able to move your creatures around the board with ease and contest your opponent's own creatures, or push a lot of damage to the orb. It can snowball out of control really quickly, actually, with the event power-ups. You can go from a position where, okay, you're just, you know, have a bit of board control, just fighting off your opponent's harvesters, and all of a sudden you can have this hand where you're like, oh, I can push 15 damage this turn, and you can make that play, and then your opponent's immediately trying to get back into the game. So there's a lot of room for creativity in this deck, and creating lines where you apply tremendous amount of pressure to your opponent or deal tremendous amounts of damage. Archers offer a strong board control because they don't die in exchange with melee creatures, at least. Ranged creatures will deal damage back to them, so keep that in mind. But most of the time, you're going to be able to move your archers into good positions where it can clear an opponent's creature, and the archer is going to be sitting there undamaged and be able to harvest Faeria, push more damage, or, you know, apply more pressure. So that's one of the great things about this deck. Problem with archers are they're pretty weak. You know, they don't have a lot of health. Cypher's Wrath, Flame Burst, Soul Drain, Wind Soldier, you name it. There's a lot of removal that can take care of the archers. And the Disciples are another win condition towards this deck, but they're weak to hard removal and transform effects. So on one hand, Disciples kind of dodge that damage-based removal, but they get targeted easy by the hard removal, whereas the archers can't really dodge the damage-based removal, and the hard removal is not really worth the investment most of the time because you're overspending to clear a creature. Certain cards can be useless without board control. Flash Wind, like a handful of Flash Winds, and Kaleem's Trains are not going to do much if you don't have a creature you can use it on. So in a lot of cases, you have to kind of figure out, you know, how how long your stuff is going to stay on board and how you can make the most of these cards like Flashwind and Kalim's Training when they do a show up in certain situations. As for matchups, again, this deck is just so weird because matchups alter based on really what your opponent's doing. I mean, straight up, you can say this deck has a good matchup against Mono Red because if you draw all your Disciples and all your power-ups, you can push the Disciples out of reach of Red's removal. However, the Red removal does very well against the yellow cards in the deck. Mono Green can really struggle against this deck if you have all the yellow cards because you can keep them at range. You can outmaneuver them with Flash Winds and Shifting Tides. But, you know, these Mono Green lists, they run Voice of Truth now. So your Disciples are not as useful as they used to be before that card was printed. So, again, it's very strange. You kind of have to adapt to what your opponent's doing. Now, I can say for certain that Blue Jump does give this deck a lot of trouble. They can get into an aggressive position very quickly, and they can contest your Archers and your Harvesters with ease. Yellow Events, again, another deck with a lot of mobility that can get close to your Archers very quickly and a lot of hard removal, so they can take care of Disciples very easily, but also clear stuff like Chargers and Archers with combinations of Wind Soldiers, Soul Drains, and stuff like Choking Sands. Land placement is pretty straightforward with this deck. It builds kind of like yellow events. You want to be building land towards your opponent most of the time to challenge whatever creatures they're playing and harvesters with your Windstorm Chargers. And your Kalim will generally go off in the opposite direction and collect on the ocean. You want to start off a desert in front of your orb if you pick up yellow creatures in your mulligan, because you want your archer to be able to start dealing damage to your opponent, and you might be able to win the game before they even have a chance to respond, depending on what cards you pick up. But if you don't have yellow creatures in your open hand and you get blue creatures, I definitely advise building your lands kind of like this at the start, because you don't want a lake in front of your orb because you can't play archers on there. And this allows you to still build towards that land strategy without interfering with your archer placement, which is a very important part of the deck. So overall, you want to establish archers and chargers near the orb, challenge your opponents on the wells, and then look for opportunities to push tremendous amounts of damage with Flash Winds, Kalim's Training, and stuff like that. It's a complicated deck to play, and I don't know if this deck doctor will do it justice, because I think with this deck you need to see what you need to do to learn it. I'm hoping that Deck Pilot will give you that information you need. That wraps up this episode of Deck Doctor. No surprise that Modgnik has created this crazy deck, and it is a lot of fun to play. I've been playing it a lot on stream recently. It's my go-to deck because I just enjoy it so much. It can be frustrating because sometimes what you draw doesn't line up with what you're trying to achieve. But I feel like the more you play this deck, the more patience you have with it, the more rewarding it becomes, because you start to see all these individual lines, and it does open up a lot of creativity. It lets you play how you want to play the deck and adapt to what your opponent's doing. Now, I don't know if I sold this deck for this Deck Doctor, just because there's a lot of hesitation. There's a lot of, you need to watch it, you need to see it to be able to understand it. So don't be put off. I would definitely say give it a go. But if you are unsure still, hoping Deck Pilot will clear that up for you. Some of the examples I've given in this video give you an idea of what you're trying to achieve. But you really need to just look at a board state, look at what your opponent's play, look at your hand and think, right, how do I win this game? Do I win by being aggressive? Do I win by pushing lots of damage? Do I win by controlling the board? Just try, you need that experience, you need to try things out and experiment and see what works. Thanks again for watching. If you do like this video, be sure to give this channel a subscribe. Be sure to check out the hub where you can find more articles, decks, and guides. Until next time, guys, take care. Have a great day.